In this section, we're going to be talking about adding measures using the Cube Wizard. First, let's talk about what is required. Required objects is at least one data source that has to be created. Once this data source is created, a data source view with the dimension and fact tables needs to be created in order to successfully create a cube and the measures within that cube. You can have multiple fact tables in your data source view, but at least you should have one fact table. The Cube Wizard can be used to add dimension related to the measures which have not been created yet. These related dimensions created with this wizard will only have the key column from that dimension table, plus any related key columns from related dimension tables that form a snowflake schema. Measures from the fact table are sourced as the aggregate values. These are used to first create a measure group. Each measure group will be related to one fact table, and then the measures in that measure group are related to the fact table as well. These can be renamed in the wizard or later in the Cube Designer. Those dimensions that are created with the Cube Wizard will have to be edited, and they are edited in the Dimension Designer. And you have to add more than just the key columns and also provide a name for the key column. You don't want to display the key to the end user, you want a description for that key. Once the cube is created, we will have to edit these dimensions in the Dimension Designer in order to refine the usage of that dimension. Here, we're going to add additional attributes or member properties and also be able to create the hierarchies that give the user a little better experience with their reporting tool. And these are all that come from the requirements of the business. Let's get started creating a new cube using an existing data source view. Alright, let's start using the Cube Wizard by opening up our existing project. If you already have it open, you can just maximize it to your screen. Here, we're seeing some windows open, so we'll start by closing these windows. The first thing we're going to do is go over to the Cubes folder in the Solution Explorer, right-click there, and create a new cube. In the Welcome screen, we'll click Next. Here, we're prompted to how we want to create the cube. The cube is sourced from a fact table, and in our case, since we have a data source view created, the existing tables is now available to us. You can also create an empty cube, which we did in a previous section of this training, as well as generating tables from no template or the AdventureWorks templates provided. We're going to use an existing table and click Next. Now we're prompted for a data source view, and in our case, we only have one data source view to work with. We'll keep that there, and then we'll look to the far right. There's a button that says Suggest, which will suggest a measure group from these tables. When we click that button, we'll notice Internet Sales gets checked, but the rest of the tables do not. The Cube Wizard is intelligent enough to understand the relationships between a fact and the dimension tables. It also goes to look through these tables to see tables that might have integer, money, or numeric type columns. Since Internet Sales is where we're going to build our first measure group, we'll keep that checked, the rest unchecked, and click Next. Next, we're given a list of what the Cube Wizard thinks are measures for this measure group. If you notice, the first two, promotion key and currency key, are actually surrogate keys to dimension tables. And when we first built the data source view, we removed those two tables from our data source view when we were using the wizard. We're going to uncheck those two because they're not needed as measures, and also revision number, which is an integer type in our fact table. The rest will all be available type of measures. What you have to be cautious of when creating a cube or dimensions is that even though more might be better and to satisfy more requests later on, it can get really confusing for the end user to see an abundance of items to select from. Sometimes they'll look at all that and decide they don't want to use the cube. So what we're going to do is we're going to uncheck everything and specifically pick order quantity, sales amount, and internet sales count, which helps satisfy the requirements from our business. We'll click Next, and we'll notice that the date dimension previously created is listed. This is because there is a relationship in the data source view between fact internet sales and dimension date. And these are for the order date, ship date, and due date columns. Because it's already created and checked, we're just going to click Next. The next part shows the additional dimensions that are not created that the Cube Wizard wants to create. Notice again that these relationships from the data source view help prompt the wizard and its intelligence to know that these dimensions need to be added. You're going to be prompted for these dimensions in the project, and their dimension usage are going to be added to the cube. We're going to uncheck the last item, which is internet sales. Because internet sales as a fact table has additional columns that could be a degenerate dimension, it thinks that it should create a dimension for that table now. We're not going to do that, and that's more of an intermediate or advanced option. The other thing you're going to notice is that the product dimension also has a tree level to subcategory and category. This is because in our data source view, the product, subcategory, and category form what's called a snowflake schema. We're going to keep all those checked and click Next. Finally, it's going to prompt us for a name for our cube. We'll let the default stick and click Finish. Now we get to the Cube Designer. I'm going to auto-hide the Solution Explorer and the properties so we can see a little more about this work area. First, you'll notice that there are multiple tabs on the top of the screen. We also notice in the upper left there's measures, and we see an internet sales measure group has been created along with order quantity, sales amount, and internet sales count. Over to the right is a data source view, just like the data source view we created from a data source. This is within the cube itself, and you'll notice dimensions have a highlight of blue, whereas the fact tables are highlighted in yellow. We can rearrange this to better fit our screen in order to be more viewable to our designer. The next tab we'll see is the Dimension Usage tab. Here, because of the relationships between the dimension tables and fact table in the data source view, the relations are automatically created for us. One to be cautious of or to look at right now is that we have the date dimension repeated 3 times. This is because we had 3 different relationships to the date dimension. By having role-playing dimension built into the multidimensional cube of analysis services, we only have to build one dimension for date and then be able to relate through this intersection of the actual surrogate key from the fact and the dimension key. This is what's called a regular relationship. In the intermediate and advanced, we'll talk about fact, reference, and many-to-many. We'll cancel out of this and go to the Browser tab. The Browser tab is where we can preview the cube. And if you notice here, there's nothing to preview because the cube has not been deployed yet. Before we deploy it, let's go back to Cube Structure and look at the bottom left. Here's where the actual dimensions created in a cube exist, and you'll notice the 3 role-playing for due, ship, and order date. We're going to go back to the Solution Explorer, right-click on our project, and go to Properties. We're going to review the deployment properties that we're going to process full, server mode is all, and then we're going to deploy it to our local host and the database ADV work DW. I'll click OK, right-click the project, and then click Deploy from the submenu. Once our deployment is finished and we receive no errors, we can go back to the Browser tab, click the Reconnect Toolbar button, and notice that now we can browse our cube. I'm going to close the deployment window for now and the output to gain some real estate space and show how to preview this. We'll drill into Measures, Internet Sales, drag sales amount across, and now we see the total sales amount for Internet sales for the whole cube. If we go to the order date, we can drag the order date year to this browser area, and then we can see by month what those values are. Now, let's look at the customer dimension. If we drill into customer dimension, all we see is the customer key. If we drag that to our browser, all we'll notice is a number inside of here. This is a surrogate key from the customer dimension. Remember, when you use the wizard to create the dimensions, it's only going to grab the key columns. We're lucky because due date, order date, and ship date have already had the date dimension created. If we look at sales territory, we see the same item. And in product, we actually have 3 keys. The product key plus the snowflake schema tables, subcategory key, and category key. That's all we're going to look at for the Cube Wizard for now. We'll return to the slides to talk about refining this project.